Meet Allama Iqbal, national poet of Pakistan, author of poetry in Urdu and Persian, and author of philosophy in Persian and English, and also the only great philosopher I know of who has an international airport named after him. 50 rupees for a cup of chai in the departure lounge. Allama Iqbal is an empiricist. He thinks we get knowledge from experience. Like William James, one of the influences on his thought, he strives for a thorough and consistent empiricism. This leads him to an interesting analysis of scientific and religious knowledge. Now, note the significance of this. Here's a great philosopher who thinks that scientific and religious knowledge are both justified by a proper understanding of experience. Now, does that sound weird? Maybe, and it does go against a number of popular assumptions, but it's not that weird, and the idea of both scientific and religious knowledge is not at all unusual among great philosophers. Now, Iqbal gives us this analysis and this idea in his book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, a very rich and complex and challenging and rewarding book. You could read it and understand 10%, and it would be a good 10% to understand. But you would misunderstand or totally fail to understand the other 90, and that's okay. Sometimes that happens with the great books in philosophy. They're meant to be read again and again and again. Now, in this book, The Reconstruction, Iqbal attempts to integrate the insights of two intellectual traditions, modern science and religious mysticism, with an emphasis on Islamic Sufism. Now, I'm about to tell you a story. It's going to come from my own notes, what I wrote about it, based on my own fallible memories, but it's a pretty accurate account of what happened. This story involves what happened one morning between 9 and 10 a.m. in E121, in Intro to Philosophy, when I gave my students the gist of Iqbal's argument for the legitimacy of both scientific and religious knowledge. Now, first I need to review the argument, and then I'll give you an overview of the conversation that followed. Iqbal says knowledge is born of reflection based on experience. There's a formula for knowledge here, a definition for knowledge. Experience plus reflection yields knowledge, or experience plus interpretation yields knowledge, or experience plus understanding yields knowledge. The interpretation, the understanding, or the reflection on experience is what yields knowledge. Two of the major varieties of knowledge are scientific knowledge, born of reflection on sensory experience, and religious knowledge, born of reflection on religious experience. Iqbal says on these matters, the facts of religious experience are facts among other facts of human experience, and in the capacity of yielding knowledge by interpretation, one fact is as good as another. Now, you can put this into an argument, from the reality of scientific knowledge to at least the possibility of religious knowledge. Here's how the argument could go. Premise: science is a source of knowledge. Premise: science derives its warrant entirely from a combination of experience and reflection on experience. Subconclusion: so experience and reflection on experience is a source of knowledge. Another premise: there is such a thing as religious experience that we can reflect on. Final conclusion: so religious experience and reflection thereon can also be a source of knowledge. That's Iqbal's interesting argument. Now, I gave this to my students, and they had some questions, concerns, some objections. I'm going to give them to you now, not word for word, but words meant to capture the heart of the matter. My replies are given more or less on behalf of Iqbal, because on this particular occasion, I work for Iqbal. When I teach Iqbal, I work for him that day. On another day, though, I work for Aquinas. On another day, I work for Confucius. On another day, I work for Nietzsche, and so on. So, first objection from my students. But sir, scientific knowledge can be subjected to tests, and religious beliefs cannot. Reply on behalf of Iqbal. Says who? I don't think Iqbal says that. What makes you think there's no such thing as a religious hypothesis that can be tested? For example, you might be able to confirm someone else's religious experience by having your own religious experience. Objection. But sir, religion is based on subjective experiences and science is not. Reply on behalf of Iqbal. Science relies on the experiences of various individuals. Those experiences are relayed from an individual scientist to everyone else by testimony. In this respect, as far as I can tell, religion is exactly the same as science. Objection. But sir, religious thought is much harder to verify than scientific theories. Reply on behalf of Iqbal. Maybe, but so what? Iqbal's analysis does not depend on the ease of verification or even on the method of verification. Maybe it is harder to test a religious belief, maybe not. Maybe it varies by religion, from one religion to another, or from one belief to another, and maybe it also varies from one scientific belief to another. And maybe overall, religious belief is less easy to verify than scientific belief, less reliable, but that doesn't actually affect Iqbal's analysis either way. The point is, you have experience, reflection on experience, and the possibility of knowledge gained therefrom in both spheres. Objection. But sir, science is about matter, and religion and ethics are not, so they aren't about anything real. Reply on behalf of Iqbal. Are you sure about that? Remember what I told you about Plato and Pythagoras? Since triangles are composed of perfectly straight line segments without width, they can't be made of matter. You can't see them, but you're pretty sure you know what they are. And since you don't know what doesn't exist, triangles must exist, and they must be non-physical realities, known through the mind rather than through sensory experience. So maybe non-physical reality is just as real as physical. Objection to Iqbal from my students. But sir, scientific thought is concrete, religion is abstract. Concrete reality is so much easier to know. Reply on behalf of Iqbal. Remember what we talked about with the what I've been calling the X-beliefs, the beliefs that are necessary if you're going to learn anything about the world from experience, which themselves cannot be learned from experience, like the principle of induction, which is the principle that we can learn about what we have not experienced from what we have, or the principle of the uniformity of nature. These are principles on which science depends. Science depends on knowledge of these things. These are the foundations of science, but they're not learned from science. Try explaining those without being abstract. If you're going to object to all abstract knowledge, you're probably going to have to object to the foundations of science. And without the foundations, where is science? If you want to be consistent and object to all abstract knowledge, you have to object to what follows from it. And there goes science. Do you really want that? Objection. But what about the conflicts between the evidence of religious experience and the scientific evidence? Reply on behalf of Iqbal. What about the conflicts between scientific evidence and scientific evidence? These conflicts come up all the time. Scientists manage them on a case-by-case basis, choosing one theory over another, based on what evidence is more solid or what interpretation of the evidence is better. In each case, you have the same formula for knowledge. You have experience plus interpretation. The best combination of experience plus interpretation wins in these conflicts. And there are also conflicts between religious experience and religious experience, and religious believers have to deal with them the same way. Well, it's the same with conflicts between religious and sensory experience. If a scientific view clashes with the religious view, you have to evaluate the experiences and the interpretation of them. In such a conflict, the best combination of solid evidence and good interpretation of the evidence wins. So this objection doesn't seem to count against religion any more than it would count against science. Rather, I don't think it counts against either. Objection. But sir, moral beliefs are relative, because in different cultures people have thought different things about morality. Reply on behalf of Iqbal. Your unstated premise is that whatever different cultures think differently about is not objectively true. Different cultures have thought different things about astronomy. Does that mean there's no objective truth about whether the Earth orbits the Sun, or vice versa? If this is a criterion for truth, science is condemned as relative along with religion. Is that really what you want? Objection. But sir, scientific knowledge is so much more systematic than morality. Reply on behalf of Iqbal. Not necessarily. You may think this is necessarily so, but you are mistaken. It's a good thing you're taking this class, because later we'll talk about Kant and Aristotle and Mill. Their analysis of morality is more systematic than science. I probably overstated that. Maybe not Mill and Aristotle, but Kant is definitely more systematic than most theories or systems in science. Now, I suspect that most of my students have been largely motivated by the tension between macroevolution and traditional monotheisms. Perhaps thinking, as many seem to think, that evolution is a test for rationality. I don't think that's correct. And now, with very little time left before class dismisses at 9:50, one of my students finally asks about evolution directly. Objection. But sir, what about evolution? Reply on behalf of Iqbal. In a clash between scientific and religious beliefs, you evaluate the evidence on which beliefs are based, and you evaluate the interpretation of the evidence. Now, it's possible that a rational person would look at the evidence and the interpretation of it with respect to evolution and look at the evidence and the interpretation of it with respect to whatever bit of Abrahamic theology from the Bible or the Quran is inconsistent with this evolutionary hypothesis, and say the best combination of evidence is contrary to evolution. A more rational person might look at it and say, no, evolution has the better evidence. Now, Iqbal goes that way. He's a theistic evolutionist. He thinks the view that God created the earth, and in some manner inconsistent with evolutionary theory, is based on a poor interpretation of the evidence from the Quran. Now, the evidence is solid, he thinks, but the interpretation was not so good. He thinks there's good reason to read the Quran non-literally in this case. So he's a theistic evolutionist, and that's the direction he goes. And my time was now running out. It was just about 9:15. Not much time left in class. Now, I have to tell my students something at the end. And as time is running out, I say something like this. I say, look, I'm not telling you that religious and scientific knowledge are entirely alike in degree of certainty or method of verification. I'm not saying they're exactly the same kind or exactly the same quality of knowledge. I'm not saying there aren't any good objections to Iqbal's view here. I'm not even saying that there are no good objections to his thesis that there is such a thing as religious knowledge from experience. But be sure to offer some good objections. Do it consistently. Don't undermine science while you're trying to promote it and not promote religion. Now, some of these objections were old territory for me. I long ago put them into the mouth of the Gray Robot here on this channel in the playlist Robots Talk About Truth, or What is Truth? I think the title of the playlist is What is Truth? Now, for my part, I do concur with Iqbal in this particular argument, not necessarily everything in this very good book. Now, my goal was not to convince my students to agree with Iqbal. The goals were to get them thinking, challenge a presupposition that I thought needed to be challenged, and introduce them to an interesting philosopher. Now, this was Intro to Philosophy. My upper level students might have given some better objections. For that matter, some of the lines of thinking in my intro course from my students, these objections to Iqbal, if they pressed on with them, might have led to a more serious concern with Iqbal, and I might well have not had any answers. Now, on that note, let me say that I also wrote about this and talked about it on Ricochet.com, and one of my interlocutors there had what I took to be a very fine objection. Iqbal, you see, is emphasizing mystical experience. He does talk about prophecy in this book as well, but the main emphasis, or at least the immediate emphasis of this argument with respect to the Sufi tradition that he's trying to integrate with contemporary science, or at least integrate insights from the traditions. With respect to mystical experience of God, I thought one of my interlocutors had a very fine objection against Iqbal, and it was that we don't have a faculty for perceiving God in these mystical religious experiences. We do have faculties for sensory experience. We have sight, we have hearing, and so on. Where's the faculty for perceiving God? We don't have that faculty. That I thought was a very good objection. You could perhaps overcome it if you can give evidence for the existence of such a faculty. Now, perhaps more importantly, let's keep going. Let's go a little deeper, and let's talk about conversations not with my intro student on that particular day, but conversations in office hours with one of my best former students who's now moved on to grad school. If religious knowledge is empirical, as Iqbal says, it seems like it's a sort of knowledge unlike scientific knowledge in that it cannot be verified or falsified. It's like knowledge of certain historical events derived from experience, but not easily testable, or maybe not testable at all. Now, this particular student and I discussed all this, and he remained skeptical of the possibility of any serious religious knowledge, and he was very fair. He was equally suspicious of historical knowledge, for reasons which apply to Socrates and Caesar, as well as to, say, miracles of Jesus. So here's how his objection runs. Maybe a religion can have an empirical foundation, but this knowledge is not as secure as scientific knowledge because you cannot test it. Now, it is important not to overstate this distinction between religious and scientific empirical knowledge. The historical foundations of any Abrahamic faith are open to at least some degree of the possibility of verification or even falsifiability from other historical sources and from archaeology. Although, alas, the discovery of the Holy Grail near Alexandretta was fictional and a wonderful film, the discovery of the tomb of Caiaphas was not fictional, and neither were the Hittites and various other relevant archaeological finds. So this objection nevertheless seems to me to be right on. Insofar as religious knowledge has a historical foundation, it remains somewhat less testable, at least before the point of death, than scientific knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean it's not knowledge. What it does mean is that, insofar as its foundations rest on empirical knowledge, religious knowledge is a different sort of empirical knowledge than scientific. It's a little less certain or a little less probable than scientific knowledge. A knowledge that is less certain or less probable, but maybe knowledge indeed, is a poorer sort of knowledge. Now, that I thought was a very fine objection. Now, I think it may be possible to answer it, and I've done some writing on the subject myself. For a start, if you want to look into some of those writings, some analyses of what C.S. Lewis and William James independently discovered about the verification of religious knowledge, run through Google these words and put them in quote marks. Can religious knowledge be verified? See if you can find a link at thinkingthroughchristianity.com where I comment on the subject. Anyway, now you've known a little bit about Iqbal. Hope you are happy to now know it. It's a good book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, from an interesting philosopher.